What's up, you guys, and welcome back to the Kingdom Culture Podcast. Today we are in the final week of the series that we have been in, looking at Gen Z and digital culture and how these worlds collide and how we can properly walk with Christ while walking in this kind of culture. So today is the final week of this series, and we are looking at how we as Christians can find boundaries as well as rhythms for rest on social media and in this digital culture. And so something that I've come to realize is that many of us don't even realize how exhausted we are because our minds are never at rest. I've been trying to put in practices over the last few weeks to really distance myself more and more from just doom scrolling and just constantly being on social media for no reason other than just to be on it. And I didn't realize how much energy and how much it really drains you of when you are constantly making an effort to be present on social media and to use it constantly. So many of us don't realize how exhausted we are, not even from real life, but just from our social media presence, because we really live in a culture that is always on. We're constantly having to check our notifications and hear other people's opinions and compare our lives to other people, to hear outrage from people about their opinions, and even to somewhat feel like we have to put on a little bit of a performance. And so social media really is not something that's neutral. It has become very formative to Gen Z and many generations in our minds. And this is not today to talk about demonizing social media in any way, but really to look at how we can walk in discipleship in a digital age. And so we have to first identify where it's draining us, because social media can very much be a drain in many of our lives if we're not cautious to use it wisely. So I want to see that, as followers of Jesus, this should shape and kind of shift the way that we interact on social media, the way that we use our phones, the way that we interact in this digital culture, because every habit we have in our lives shapes us. And it can either shape us and form us better for stewarding the gifts we have for the kingdom, to better equip us to be disciples, or it can shape us negatively. And so Scripture consistently kind of gives this warning about what we should fix our minds on. Like Romans 12:2, it gives the command, do not be conformed to this world, to the patterns of this world, the things that they are doing. And then in Proverbs 4, it says to guard your heart, because everything that you do flows from your heart. And so I think that social media can kind of train us to do a couple of different things. Number one, it has kind of trained us to react very quickly instead of taking time for discernment and to act wisely. I think that it has also encouraged us to be performative rather than practicing our faith privately. I think that it also has taught us to constantly need to consume endlessly instead of taking time to really reflect on what it is we're learning, our lives. Like, we should have time at the end of the day to decompress our day, like to look back, to reflect on our day, not to immediately be on our phones and be disassociating from what actually happened in the day we just walked through. And so an important distinction I want to make is that the question we're posing is not, is social media sinful? But rather, what is social media forming me into, whether intentionally or unintentionally, through my use of it consistently? Because in Scripture, I want to talk about these models of boundaries and rhythms of taking rest, because in Scripture, Jesus withdrew often. Jesus really modeled rhythms of rest and withdrawal. And so I want to shift a little bit to Jesus' model and see what he did. In Scripture, there are a couple of different examples I want to point to. One is in Luke 5:15-16. It tells us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to be able to pray and talk to the Father and have that time alone. Mark 1:35 describes an early morning and solitude prayer that he would take part in. Matthew 14 even shows us that after ministry, sometimes he would withdraw. He would go up to the mountain alone. He would take time to be by himself and have these rhythms of rest and withdrawing from constantly being around people. And so even though Jesus was needed by everyone, he still took time to himself. And so if Jesus needed boundaries, and if Jesus practiced having boundaries to decompress, then we need these things as well. And so I think a lot of Christians really struggle with the idea of logging off, taking time away from social media, from their phones, from being constantly entertained and constantly poured into from outside sources. And some common struggles that I see, especially with young Christians, is people have a fear of missing out. The FOMO is real, and people constantly are experiencing FOMO. People have this fear of being irrelevant. People worry that if they don't know the current trends, they don't know what's going on, they don't know, what all's happening in the news, like that they're going to miss out. And I think this applies to all ages. Or what we talked about last week, that they have begun to confuse visibility with faithfulness. That if people don't see them posting about church, if people don't see them posting about their Bible, if people don't see them posting about their faith, that people are going to think that their faith isn't existent. And that shouldn't be the reason why we are faithful. It should not be to show other people or to prove a point to other people. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am not God." Not for us to post so that people know that he is God, not for us to constantly have to talk in groups and make sure that people hear us as the loudest voice. These are good things to be sharing, but to be still. And, if we don't see God as the same God in private as we see him when we're at church or as we see him when we're in front of people, then we really need to work on deepening that relationship. Ecclesiastes 3 even says that there is a time to be silent as well as there is a time to speak. And so, as much as we are taking time to be vocal, to speak, to share, we should also have an adequate amount of time that we are being silent, that we are in our word, that we are talking to God, that we are not having to do things on social media, not having to do things for the vision of people, but so that it's a real and intimate interaction with God. Because not every moment in our faith journey requires us to post. Not every moment requires a commentary. Sometimes an indicator of spiritual maturity can actually be your silence. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is to take time to withdraw, to set that boundary, and to not have to speak up on everything. Because having rest in your relationship with God is not a sign of laziness, but it can actually be an indicator of obedience. And so I want to reframe this to look at it biblically. Exodus 20:8-10 shows us that having Sabbath is not just a suggestion, but it's a command. It's something that we need to have in our lives. Hebrews 4 shows us that a Sabbath rest still remains for God's people. There is still a draw that we need to take time, that we need to take Sabbath to spend in time with God, to not be constantly going. In Matthew 11, he says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." The drawing near to God has the opportunity for us to find rest. Sometimes it can be so busy and so stressful in life that we don't know when we have a time to take a rest, when we have time to withdraw. There are times that even though I'm not sleeping in extra, I'm not really taking a day of rest, times that I am in the Word with God, I leave feeling so much more rested and so much more refreshed and so much more full than I did coming into it, not because of any extra time that I took resting necessarily, but because God has the power to refresh our spirit and to give us that rest. And so something interesting that I see in the Bible is that God built this rhythm of rest into creation before sin even entered the world. God had a foreknowledge of what was going to happen. God has this understanding of how he created us, and he created rest to be part of the blueprint. And so when we are constantly scrolling and constantly interacting and constantly being poured into, it trains us to actually resist that rest. I think many of us have probably spent or had an experience where we stayed up all night on our phones, or we were up so late and then we realized it's like 3 a.m. and you're like, dang, I didn't realize I had been watching YouTube for that long, right? Because we are literally being trained to resist the rest that we desperately need, because it continues to build our algorithms and it continues to help whatever resources it is that we're using. And so we have to be cautious to not defy the blueprint that God gave us, but instead to be intentional with our rest and make it a priority, because there are practical and biblical boundaries that we can follow when it comes to the digital age that we're living in and social media, because our rest gives God the opportunity to be fully in control. It gives us the opportunity to be connected with him, to hear from him. And so some practical rhythms that I've heard from people, that maybe you could choose one of these and think this week on how you want to take some real rhythms of rest when it comes to social media. Some people do completely phone-free prayer time. Every little while I will try to take like an hour and just take that time to pray. No phone, no music, no nothing. I literally just take that time to pray and be in private, quiet time with God. Sometimes it looks like Sabbath, having a Sabbath from your social media, like take a day, completely detox, cleanse, don't be on your phone. Maybe it looks like taking a week off of social media, taking a month off of social media, disconnecting yourself from those those urges to constantly be on social media, fighting that temptation. Maybe it means when you wake up in the morning, you require yourself to be in the Word before you even get onto social media. Maybe it means that you take time to unfollow and detox from accounts that are fueling you to look into comparison or fueling anger in your life, to detox your social media and cleanse it of anything that is leading you away from a godly mindset. 1 Corinthians 10:23 says, I have the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. Showing us that not everything we have that you can do is something that you need to do. Sometimes these things are actually more harmful than they are helpful. And so some things that I think we can identify this week that would actually be really beneficial is a habit that we could pause. Something that we can do that can help us pause everything around us in this digital culture, but to just take time to recenter on God. Find a boundary to set, whether it's an unfollowing, whether it's taking a day away from using your phone, and find a way to start those rhythms of rest in your week this week and see how much it shifts and changes the way that you, number one, interact in your relationship with God. But number two, the way that you view social media, and I guarantee you will start to see this as less and less and less of a priority and less and less of a need, because you start to recenter and realize this is not what life is all about. Psalm 131:2 says, I have calmed and quieted my soul. God has the opportunity to calm and to quiet our souls so that we're not constantly in need of filling our minds and filling our spirits with things on social media, because God has the opportunity and the capacity to fill those things. Because faithful and rested and rooted people have the opportunity to change things in ways that people who are constantly consuming negativity on the media can't. So I hope that this spoke to you this week and helped you to understand a little bit better how to place those boundaries on social media and why it's important that we do so, understanding that Jesus also had boundaries and found rhythms of rest in his life. Make sure that you're following the Renew Network, this channel, renew.org, so that you stay up to date with every future episode. Check out some of the other resources on this channel, the podcast, the articles, all these different things. They're really powerful, and I guarantee that something will speak to you if you take a look today. Thank you guys. We're going to take a couple of weeks before we prepare to get into our brand new season. So I will see you guys next time. Until then, be blessed.